And that, my dear Crocomire, is why I think if you scan all the Metroid amiibos in a specific order in this room, you will unlock a new armor based on the EMMIs, which will let you explore the empty area on the east side of the map, which in fact is just a really super secret zone that will give us the final clues to know exactly what's going to happen in Metroid 6.
Albert, this is interesting and all, but I'm just a plushie.
Just to clarify, this is a follow-up to my previous video regarding the many mysteries in Metroid Dread's plot, its world, and how it gave us a new perspective on the events of the previous games. So while not a mandatory watch to understand this video, I recommend viewing it just to see what topics I already went over on it, since I won't touch them again in this one. So, Metroid Dread, the game that still hasn't left my mind even after multiple playthroughs. Especially since every time I go back to it, I seem to discover a new detail in the environment or story that just keeps haunting my mind every other day. The fact that we aren't inherently given the answers to the smaller details gets me really excited at times, since it allows my imagination to wonder about their mysteries in a way that keeps me engaged to come back to dissect what they could truly mean. As I've said before, this is part of the reason I fell in love with the series, because the lack of concrete information invited me to get invested in the world and build a small narrative of what could have happened in them. And once you learn that a lot of these minor details more or less have a purpose, it makes you realize how much work and passion the developers really put into the game, since not everyone will even notice them to begin with. I've always had a lot of fun just trying to piece the clues together to come up with the answers to what the developers may be trying to tell us, and chose to omit to avoid bloating the narrative or distracting us too much from the gameplay at hand. And Dread is no exception to this by having so many mysteries, some of which I think I've managed to find possible answers for and wanted to share with you guys. Needless to say, most of this video is just my theories on the matter. Nothing here is quite official, so make sure you take what I say with a grain of salt. And just like last time, if there are other mysteries or story beats you would like to see me discuss in a later video, feel free to let me know and I'd be more than happy to give you my 2 cents on the matter. Also, I wanted to give a quick shout out to all the wonderful members on my socials or streams who've reached out to help with making this video. But with all that said, let's get started. To start this time, I wanted to go over ZDR's map as a whole, and how it more or less tells us a story of how the Mockings used to live on the planet before its downfall at the hands of the X-Parasites. Considering that the surface level of Hanuvia seems to be rather barren, I want to suggest that maybe Gavaran could have been one of the main places of origins for the Chozus on this planet, or at least one of the main regions they once inhabited, due to the amount of structures they left in that area and the amount of resources they could hypothetically harvest from it. Then again, maybe the Mockings sought refuge on the planet's caverns because ZDR's surface may have been too hazardous, just like how it was on planet Sevis. But perhaps just building below the surface could be something that Chozo civilizations like doing as a whole, since they also excavated on SR-388. The archives also show that the Mockings conducted what seems to be combat rituals. And with all the abandoned structures that have been claimed by nature, it is safe to assume that maybe they had a settlement here at one point, before eventually moving on and creating Ferenia and Elun. And considering that their entrances that connect to Gavaran are outfitted with proper security measures, it is safe to assume they built these to keep the wildlife out and protect their new homes. Once Ferenia was established, they did what Chozo do best and continued building downwards, creating a lab so they could conduct their researches on bioweapons and other arsenals to further increase their strength. I could see the labs here being able to operate at a capacity by themselves, but surely the Mockings wanted to push the limits of their creations, so they excavated into Dyren to grow their facilities and into Cataris to harness the planet's thermal energy to expand their settlements. At the same time, they most likely explored elsewhere and uncovered Burenia, a massive underwater cavern filled with new wildlife where the Mockings established a research facility to learn from the organisms, and perhaps find a way to adapt their findings into weaponry such as the gravity suits. This leaves Altaria as the most recently discovered location where they hadn't quite terraformed, given that the area still feels much more untamed than other locations, and they most likely found this area following the magma flow from Cataris. While it's hard to tell what the Chozos intended for this area, I like to think that it could have been a location to vent out some of the heats from the labs in Cataris, and help keep the rest of the planet or future installations warm as well. Lastly, Hanubia got made into an outpost or docking station for their ships, with a main elevator connecting to most areas for ease of travel, which is what Samus used at the beginning of the game, and you can also see this in the background of other rooms. Now, why the Chozos didn't simply build here could be from either the seemingly constant harsh climate on the surface, or perhaps because the Mockings had already stripped it bare of resources and moved on, or to simply hide their settlements from other species that could be analyzing nearby planets. While I'm on the subject regarding the locations in ZDR, one thought I always had in my mind is that Elun once used to be a portion of Ferenia, which was cut off after the X-Parasite infestation to more or less be able to contain their spread. The reasoning behind this comes in part from the overall design of the areas, as both share a lot of similar architecture in general, but also from the logic of their locations. Considering that Elun was another main location where the Mocking lived, it doesn't make much sense that the only way to go from here to the main city is by traversing a good portion of Gavaran, especially when you consider that both are so close to each other that a simple tunnel or transport could easily connect them and keep them away from the violent wildlife. When you visit the lower west side of Ferenia, you see some vague hints at some sort of tunnel or construction, which to me was a sign that maybe these two were indeed connected at some point. Given how developed ZDR's locations are, it is hard for me to believe that this was something the Mockings wouldn't fully address or abandon halfway. And to me, it makes sense for Ravenbeak to have used this route to lure the rest of the infected through Ferenia to trap them in Elun, as to avoid the parasites from escaping into the wildlife of Gavaran, thus exacerbating the problem. Taking into account how we see the X behave, they only start to show their true colors once their copy bodies are on the brink of defeat, almost as if they purposely hide until it's necessary. So they didn't have a reason to reveal themselves from the get-go, since they will benefit from slowly consuming the Chozo while they weren't aware of their presence. Thus perhaps Quietbrobe was the one to inform Ravenbeak when the first one was showing signs of infection, since he witnessed it firsthand on SR3D8, which prompted the Mocking to quickly lure all the warriors into Elun before sealing them off to ensure his survival, while the Thoha devised a countermeasure to their problem. Moving on, another question I've had regarding the world of ZDR is about the presence of Aeion in it. This is not from the point of finding it implausible that the energy source could exist on other planets, but more from how it works in this game, since it's no longer an expendable energy source you have to gather, but rather something Samus can now naturally generate over time. I think that the Aeion cubes, for lack of a better term, have a special property to them that on top of giving the user a specific power, they also come with the ability to self-generate the small amount of Aeion necessary in order to use it. The main reason behind this thought has to do with Ravenbeak, who also uses some Aeion abilities, yet doesn't seem to rely on an external source to power them, and neither did Corpius when it had the Phantom Cloak stuck inside of its tail. Given how these Aeion items are guarded by more elaborate and unique statues, it's easy to assume that they are something intrinsically valuable to the Mockings, which few get a chance to own. So maybe these statues could be honoring previous leaders or notable figures of their tribe who now protect some of the more significant power-ups, and hand them off to anyone worthy of harnessing its power. Speaking of unique weaponry on the planet, another enigma some people have brought to my attention is how can Samus acquire tools from the EMMI she destroys? As I brought up in the previous video, I think it's safe to assume that the robots have their Chozo abilities installed before being dispatched onto the planet, since their naming convention has the initials of whichever item they have on their arsenal. These abilities were either handed to the Federation by Samus to aid them in an endeavor to create a deterrent to the X-Parasites, or reverse engineered thanks to the shared knowledge Samus has offered them over the years. So I always assumed that the EMMIs would just naturally have the power-ups somewhere inside their chassis to begin with, and by neutralizing them, Samus has enough time to harness their power-ups from within. Others have speculated that perhaps the Federation or Exilian Star Corporation could hold a grudge against Samus for destroying their expensive machines, especially since Adam asked her to treat them with care at the beginning of the game. But I think after explaining the circumstances of what happened, I don't think they would hold her actions against her, especially when she finished the job of exterminating the X on ZDR, not to mention also taking down a powerful Chozo overlord that destroyed and repurposed the EMMIs as seen in the archives. However, the main thought that has stayed on my mind for the longest time has to do with the mysterious origins and abilities of one of the most iconic bosses in the game, Experiment C57. I think it's easy to assume that this creature belongs to the same family as Corpius, given their many physical similarities. And seeing how the archives show the Mockings being able to tame or overpower their creatures, then it makes sense that they could use them as subjects to create bioweapons or to test some of their new weaponry. Doubly so since they live on similar biomes to the Chozos, and with their size could withstand more experimentation. Now, when exactly did C57's experimentation begun is a bit harder to decipher, though I have a feeling that this could have just happened or at least be continued sometime after Quiet-Rook's arrival on the planet. Not just from the fact that we see the Chozo studying the creature in Archive 3, but also from its special abilities and what they can tell us about the monster. While Corpius had the powers of the Phantom Cloak, C57 instead is using a powerful beam as its primary attack, which is easy to identify as the Hyper Beam, given that it shares the same hue and power as the one Ravenbeak uses as his weapon of choice, as well as Samus in the final moments of the game, which we can confirm is indeed the Hyper Beam by checking the inventory screen during the final escape sequence. So, to answer the question of what would be the item you got if Samus had a chance on absorbing the X-Core from this fight, my bet would be on her getting the Hyper Beam, considering that it was the main attack used by the boss. Nonetheless, C57's true purpose could be more than just being a bioweapon with high firepower, but to indeed test out the possibilities of giving another organism the same energy siphon abilities from the Metroids, as an alternative solution to fulfill Ravenbeak's plans much before learning about Samus's new capabilities. As we see during the boss fight, the monster uses its new claws to grip itself to the environment and start regaining its health from absorbing the power generated by the main reactor in Cataris. It even has the same magenta hue that is also present when Samus uses her newfound Metroid powers. With this, I am not saying that C57 is a Metroid, nor that it has their DNA, but rather that it has powers similar to those that made the Metroids such dangerous weapons, perhaps as a way to find another method to safely implement them into other beings. This mutation could have come a byproduct of Quiet-Rook from creating an alternative weapon to please his captor, or as a tool to fight off the X infestation that occurred on the planet. Or, as I mentioned just earlier, a way to test out implementing their powers onto other organisms. The next subject I wanted to discuss concerns the mysterious purple X-Parasite from the game's finale. We've seen these creatures come in all sorts of colors, but never truly one as bizarre as this purple one and its inherited ability to replicate multiple hosts. To keep this point brief, I think this parasite gained its weird properties from perhaps absorbing the artificial abilities of an experiment creature, which perhaps, in the hands of an X, allowed it to be able to assimilate more than one host. Now notice how I mentioned an experiment creature, and not specifically C57 since, you know. Yeah, not only was it an X-Core and not a regular parasite, but it also got properly deep-fried to say the least. What I am suggesting is that considering the naming convention of the boss, there were most likely many other attempts to perfect the creature that we don't see in the environments of Dayren. The main reason I think this X-Parasite got its mutations from absorbing an experiment off-screen is because its pigment is close to the aura of the experiment's artificial abilities, which perhaps translated into this new power once it was adopted by the X. On top of this, the amalgamation Ravenbeak X has some physical characteristics as Corpius and C57, such as its mouth splitting open and a lower body that completely lacks legs. It's also worth mentioning that the purple X could have simply been a callback to the early builds of Metroid Fusion, where the parasites were depicted reusing the sprites from Super's Bions but notably colored purple. I know this is not a totally airtight theory, but I felt like throwing my hat into the ring to try and offer some explanation to this weird phenomenon. Worst case, you can always blame it up to bird magic. Lastly, there are a few things regarding the iconic Metroid suits and the other implications it might give us regarding the lore of the series. This suit allows Samus to use the full extent of her new energy siphoning powers, while also granting invincibility against any form of damage. But most curiously, it also gets rid of all her other power-ups, most notably the Aeion abilities. While I don't think there's a specific story reason for this phenomenon, I like to think that perhaps somehow the suit itself may have absorbed the Aeion energy to generate a new power supply, which could have resulted in Samus gaining a new version of the Hyper Beam. The Chozo memories in Samus Returns show us that Aeion could have been one of the main reasons why the Metroids evolved into uncontrollable creatures. And perhaps Samus constantly using and generating this energy source on ZDR could be another reason for her powers awakening in such a volatile state. Maybe on top of reacting to Ravenbeak's presence and possibly gaining more of the energy source from the X-Parasites, now this new constant flow of Aeion could have slowly been causing the Metroid DNA within to rapidly mutate, and perhaps even spread to the rest of her power suits. It is safe to assume that the Metroid genes are highly unstable, which makes sense considering the pressure the Thoha were under when they created them. Yet it makes me wonder if it tends to overthrow anything it comes into contact with. This train of thought comes from how Ravenbeak implies that if it weren't for the Thoha genes within Samus, the Metroid vaccine would have immediately taken over her. So, does the Metroid DNA just take over the other life forms from within, or would its killer instinct simply take over and grant them with new abilities? If this is the case, then it's a bit ironic that the Chozo solution to the X-Parasite's infestation would have a similar effect on other beings. But then again, it's hard to tell if they ever accounted for such a transfusion to happen in the first place. I like to imagine that on a regular person, the process will result in certain doom. Yet in the case of Samus, thanks to her unique condition of possessing Chozo genes, resulted in creating a strange mutation within her body which ended in this outcome. Who knows, maybe thanks to her Thoha genes is how Samus was able to more or less control the Metroid DNA from killing her and get them to work on simply targeting any X-Parasites within her body. But in the end, it could all just be a case of conveniently placed bird magic.
Just in time.
This aspect of figuring out unanswered questions is probably one of my favorite things to do once I finish a game. Try to discover little details I missed and see how they help move the narrative forward, or how they try to establish some minor side story regarding the history of the areas visited, or the details hidden in plain sight that help answering the questions we may be trying to solve. While it may be annoying to some fans to not get more lore in these games as a feature to get concrete answers on some of the more ambiguous mysteries, I know I'm not the only one who enjoys trying to piece things together by overanalyzing what's in the game to discover what the developers left hidden in the finer details. Not every minute detail needs to have an extensive lore entry to keep focus on the main narrative and avoid disrupting its pacing. In storytelling, what you directly tell your audience is as important as what you don't, which I think it's something that the developers have used over the years to emphasize the gameplay loop and reward those who go the extra mile to get fully immersed in the worlds presented by the games. Hey there, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that if you want to catch up with some of the streams, you can do so over on the second channel, Orpheon Station. And if you want to help support the channel, consider checking out the Patreon page or the merch store. There are some new Metroid Dread designs that I think you might like. And if you're in the mood for another video, how about checking out one of these two?
plushie murder, yay!